Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies from Mark Griffin, and I very much welcome Elena Whittam as a new member to the committee and invite her to declare any interest relevant to the work of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee.
Thanks, Convener, and it's good to be back on the committee. In terms of item 6 this morning, I would just like to declare a non-financial interest in the fact that I used to work for North Ayrshire Women's Aid for over a decade.
Okay, thanks very much, Helena. Okay, our next item of business is to decide whether to take items 5 and 7 in private. Are we all agreed? Okay, thank you. So our next item of business is an evidence session on the work of the Scottish Commission on Social Security. And I welcome to the meeting Ed Pybus, Chair, and Judith Patterson, Board Member of the Scottish Commission on Social Security. So thanks very much for joining us today. And I'm going to invite Ed Pybus to make some brief opening remarks.
Thanks all of you for your interest in the work of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, the support since we've been set up in 2019 and the invitation today. It's a privilege to come here and talk about our work. I think many of you probably already know me, but my name's Ed Pybus and I'm, as you say, Chair of SCOSS, and I've been involved with Social Security for the last 20 years or so. And throughout that time, I've always been looking at ways in which the system can be improved to better deliver for all of us. So it was a privilege last August to be asked to chair SCOSS. Our scrutiny is a small but key part, I think, of the process of continuous improvement that is embedded in the social security system in Scotland. As you know, Social Security Scotland is now delivering 17 benefits, all of which have detailed regulations behind them, regulations that we have scrutinised and provided detailed comment on. And embedded in all our work, as in the whole of the Scottish social security system, are the social security principles. And a key one of these principles is that social security is itself a human right and essential for realisation of other human rights. And so when we're undertaking our work, we take that very seriously and we take into account the obligations there are under international human rights instruments. So our work is very much founded in those human rights principles. Our scrutiny work draws on the members' expertise in human rights, but also in social security law and practice and policy and strategy development, but also draws on the views and experiences from the stakeholders that we work with, whom we greatly thank for their time and support. And we also work closely with officials to understand the intent of the regulations and discuss any areas we'd like to see any clarification. And we hope our reports and the scrutiny process improves the regulations that come to Parliament and are helpful to this committee as well in your scrutiny role. As I say, I've only been in post for a year and SCOSS was set up in 2019, so most of our reports have been produced under the excellent stewardship of our previous chair, Sally Witcher, and the interim co-chairs, Dr Mark Simpson and Judith Patterson, who's also here today. So, yeah, a huge thanks for them in their work in getting SCOSS established and the work that's done. And also thanks to the other two commissioners, Adam Bennett and Marilyn Howard as well, and the work they put in. I think you've got the various figures in our written submission, but we've scrutinised regulations that set up new benefits, that amend the rules for those benefits, that uprate benefits. I think we've completed 36 reports, making over 360 recommendations addressing technical legislative changes, policy decisions, and matters relating to the delivery of social security. And also, approximately 90% of the recommendations we've made have been accepted by the Scottish Government. This year we published our first report under our statutory function to assess the extent to which the expectations set out in the Social Security Charter, which embeds those principles that I spoke about, how are those expectations are being fulfilled. This is our kind of proactive function rather than reactive, when we can look more widely at how the social security system is delivering for people and how the principles and charter are being upheld, and is a key part of that continuous improvement that I mentioned. It's an exciting time for social security at the moment as case transfer nears completion, and we move away from scrutinising regulations setting up new benefits towards scrutinising amendments and changes being made to the existing benefits. And I think, if anything, this is even more complex than setting up the system. So we welcome also the changes to our remit and governance that came in with the changes to the Act, and we intend to continue to provide robust, effective and efficient scrutiny of everything that is covered in our extended role, work with you and the Scottish Government to make sure our expertise is contributing to the ongoing development of the social security system. So it's a pleasure to be here today. Look forward to your questions and also to having an ongoing dialogue with the committee as to how best we can use our expertise to continue to support your work.
Okay, hey, thanks very much, Ed. That's very much appreciated. I'm just going to start with questions and I'm going to invite Bob Dodison. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning and thank you for joining us this morning. I wanted to ask maybe a couple of questions about the independent review of SCOS that took place, I think, 2023. You mentioned, I really should put a context to that. I should acknowledge before I ask you where you are with the recommendations in that review that it did find the work that SCOS has done has been widely recognised as making a significant improvement to the social security system in Scotland. So when I pull on and say, where are you with those recommendations? That's the context to it, of course. So there were 15 recommendations, I understand. What progress has been made today in implementing those?
Yeah, thank you. Shall I pick that up, Ed? Yeah, it was published in 2023, as you say, and we had a chance as SCOS members to feed into that our sort of 3 years' worth of experience of delivering independent scrutiny. We were really, really pleased that the review was so positive about our work, as you've said. It made recommendations about, it was very wide-ranging, about remit, governance, operations. But I'll pick out maybe 2 or 3 just to mention specifically. But overall, I'm pleased to say that all of the recommendations have now been implemented. And so that's all to the good. They were all very welcome. So just to pick out maybe 2 or 3 things that the review recommended out of those 15. So one that you'll know very well is that it said that more regulations from the 2018 Act should come under our remit, and that needed primary legislation, which is now in place, I'm glad to say. So we're happy about that more regulations will come within our, will be subject to independent scrutiny. We always found when we were getting draft regulations to scrutinise, it was very hard to actually separate out what's formally within remit and what isn't, because they were all tied together in one bundle. So it makes absolute sense to us to have all of that within our remit now. So that's one thing that's now just happened. So you'll maybe have noticed the review also said that SCOS shouldn't be subject to external audit. So that came about as a consequence of SCOS being set up as a body corporate. So that status, with hindsight, wasn't appropriate for a body the size of SCOS with a modest budget like we've got. So we have been assiduously operating that external audit, but it has been quite arduous in governance terms. So it's pleasing to see that requirement, which was a bit outsized for our body, has been removed from this financial year. And then finally, I'll just mention what was very important to us at the time this review was undertaken. We were quite understaffed at SCOS, and the review recommended that we bring on board new secretariat staff and that we bring on board new chair and board members, and that we review those resources regularly. So I'm pleased to say, as Ed has said in his remarks, that we've now got a full complement. We've got a chair, we've got 4 board members. Now, that's the maximum that we're allowed in the Act, so we're up to the maximum. And our secretariat currently has 4 staff. So we're doing well. Still a small team, I would say, for the functions that we've got. But the review recommended keeping the capacity under review, which we are doing together with the sponsor team of the Scottish Government.
Okay, that's very helpful. It's sometimes hard to interrogate further when you see all recommendations have been implemented. So that's positive. I won't pursue the resource issue. Colleagues will do that in questions later. Can I just ask one follow-up question? I should pick one recommendation that you didn't mention just to get on record where you are with it, and that would be SCOS should consider reviewing its stakeholder engagement strategy, which is recommendation 10. It would be helpful to know what the outcome of that was, just briefly, because I know we are short for time this morning, so we have a pressed evidence session. That would be good to know. But also, there was a recommendation that there should be a further review in 27-28. Are you already citing what you would like that to focus on in particular?
Thank you. If I just take that second question, and Ed's going to just mention where we're up to with the stakeholder engagement. I would just say that the recommendations have only just been fully implemented in the last couple of months. So to be honest, we haven't started looking ahead to the 2027 review yet. But we have just had an away day for the team in the last couple of weeks. So we are starting to think more widely about how we're doing, and so at some point, hopefully, we will start to think more specifically about suggestions for the review, but as of now, we haven't.
Just on that point, I was asked a good question at another event as to how the scrutiny process is working in Scotland and where the gaps are. And I was like, well, that's an interesting question. It's been on the back of my mind ever since, and so that's certainly going to be one of my focuses over the next year, to think about how the whole process works. Now we've done case transfer, how that scrutiny works, and if there are any gaps. In terms of the stakeholder strategy, yes, so that was discussed in detail at our Way Day. We're looking at ways in which we can engage more widely with a wider range of stakeholders. We're also looking at how we can bring that expertise into SCOS, either through subcommittees or expert advice and things like that. And we'll probably go on to touch on the report we did on the Charter. And in that, what we did is we worked with external organisations to carry out engagement with people with experience or people we need to work with. So that's another aspect that we're going to pursue to make sure we're getting all those voices heard in the conversation.
Thank you. No further questions, Gavina?
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Paul Keenan. Thanks.
Convener, and good morning to the panel. My questions kind of focus on some of the content of the annual report in terms of the funding and the finance of SCOS. So from the annual report in 23-24, we saw that expenditure was going to exceed the budget in 24-25. Now, that wasn't a huge overspend. I mean, I think 450,000 compared to the projected spend being 470,000. So I suppose committee is just interested to know, has that been resolved? And is it a view about the sort of financial sustainability, I suppose, of SCOS going forward?
Yes, it's a short answer. Yeah. It has been resolved. In the annual report, it noted that we would do a budget review halfway through 2023-24, recognising the sort of challenging financial position. That resulted in that revised budget allocation of a slightly higher amount. But at year end, our final budget was, I think, around about 430,000, so below even the original projection. So in the midpoint, we weren't entirely sure exactly where it was going to land, but by the end of the year, we were well within that budget. And that budget surplus returns back to the general Scottish Government pot. So, yeah, we were able to meet that. Part of the reason was because of a vacancy in the Secretariat team for a period, which reduced the cost, but also there was contingency for some IT spend, moving our website from server to server, stuff like that, which came in slightly under budget as well. And we also budgeted for work on the Charter report, which allowed us to ensure that, for example, a British Sign Language version of the reports were produced and accessibility stuff. So we had some discretionary spend, which we managed. But overall, we managed to keep that within the original budget.
And do you feel that you're now in a position where the budget planning process, I suppose, will be easier because, I suppose, to borrow a phrase, known unknowns are perhaps lessened by where we are in terms of the process around transfer? And I suppose, are you finding that the engagement with government in terms of your needs, in terms of saying, here's the need and how do we get to the budget figure that will work for us? I mean, is that quite I suppose a communicative and open process?
It is, yes. So that's through discussion with the sponsor team. So our budget allocation for this year, 25-26, is 550,000. The huge bulk of our spend is on staff costs, and so that's kind of fixed, regardless really of how much scrutiny we need to do. Our Secretariat staff team and costs is the huge part of the budget, and that doesn't change. Where we've got the discretionary spend is spending on the work we do around Charter, so whether that's commissioning external research, as I said, working with partners to do engagement, the cost of producing extra reports and stuff like that. And so within our next year's budget, we've got a contingency to spend on a bit of discretionary spend to spend on that charter work, which will allow us to do more. But yeah, our core costs, we're pretty clear what they're likely to be, and the discussion with the Scottish Government has been, with the sponsor team, has allowed us to have a budget that will meet that.
That's helpful. And you referred to, I suppose, the increase in terms of secretariat. And I mean, it was good to hear Judith as well talk about kind of getting up to full capacity in terms of board members and those sorts of things. But, I mean, has that changed the way SCOS has worked? I mean, I think I've heard already that you feel like you're kind of, you know, being both efficient, but also you're able to respond to things. So the secretariat role in particular.
Judith might want to comment on this, but I mean, from my point of view, when I came in, so I was part of that increase and expansion. So I feel very privileged to have come in at a point where we had a full board and a full secretariat team. And I know there was a huge amount of work that went on before that. But yeah, now also as the organisation has grown and has been in place longer, we're getting processes in place that allow things to work more efficiently. We're working out where we can do things more effectively. But I don't know if you want to say anything on there.
No, I mean, we did manage to fulfil all our scrutiny functions despite being low in the water with our staffing. But honestly, when we got properly staffed, it's just made a huge difference. The things that we wanted to do an awful lot better, in particular stakeholder engagement, we just simply didn't have the resources to do, and now we do. And that's made a huge difference to how effective we can be and how evidence-based our scrutiny can be, and it's particularly enabled us to embark on this really important proactive part of our role, which with the number of staff that we had pre the review, we just simply couldn't do.
And it sounds as though it's, you know, in terms of timing of more and more people accessing either new benefits or being transferred to benefits, it's probably quite crucial that that lived experience piece is at the forefront of what you're doing. Exactly.
As we move on to things that are perhaps less technical and more into experience of operations, absolutely.
Thanks, Kavina.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite Liz Smith in. Thanks.
I'm going in on question 5 on universalism, if that's all right.
Yes.
Mr Pybus, there is a massive issue, as you are well aware, about the principle of universalism. Very nice in theory to be able to say that we want to play out benefits to people on a universal basis. As the government describes it, the social contract with the people of Scotland, vitally important in terms of trying to ensure that we provide benefits across the board. But if you look at what the medium-term financial strategy was telling us yesterday, and particularly what the Scottish Fiscal Commission is telling the Finance Committee of this Parliament, we can't afford it all. That's the bottom line. And what I'm interested to hear from yourselves is, when it comes to ensuring that we are supporting those most in need, do you think the principle of universalism is the right approach, or do you think we have to be a bit more careful about trying to target those who are really in very considerable need first?
So I think SCOS's remit is defined in legislation is very clear, and we play a role in that pre-legislative scrutiny role. And we're not in the role of policy development. So those sort of decisions are very much for the governments to decide, whether it's the UK government or the Scottish government. And part of the reason is that's where our remit sits, and we don't have the space to be doing that policy development. But also in kind of practical terms, if we're involved too much in developing policy, which will then lead to regulations, which we're then scrutinising, it feels like we're in that kind of circular role. So the policy decisions, they are, obviously, there's a huge sector that is of engaging with the government around what that should look like. There's many different views as to the best way to do it. What we do is, once those policy decisions have been made, we look at the regulations to make sure they're meeting those policies. But there is a role for us in that to, as I say, use the principles to guide that discussion, and also using the sort of human rights approach to look at what those regulations are doing.
I'm asking the question because you have very considerable experience of dealing with the broad issues within the social security system. And you've obviously had very considerable success in some of that, and therefore I think it's incumbent upon this committee and others to listen to that experience. And when it comes to advising the government about the facts that they will have to interrogate in order to present their policy, it's very important, I would think, to give them some guidance on where you think we can make the biggest difference, especially to people in poverty. And that might take some difficult decisions, particularly, as I say, set against the backdrop that the Fiscal Commission's providing. So I'm just interested to know whether you...
Can I just come in there? Whilst, the role of SCOS, I don't actually think it's part of that question that you're asking, and it's kind of wider than that.
Well, forgive me, but I think they have very considerable experience that can help us.
But isn't, we're obviously scrutinising the role that SCOS actually play at the moment, rather than their wider experience.
I'm picking up what was in our papers. But anyway, forgive me for that, because I do actually think this is a very important part of the whole social security debate. So any advice you can provide to us on that evidence would be very helpful.
I mean, sorry.
To spell that SCOS have no policy role in terms of the remit that they carry out.
Yeah, I'm not asking for the policy role, I'm asking for some of the evidence that they provide. But we'll leave it there. But anyway, I do think we can benefit from your experience in telling us what we should be looking at.
I mean, these are sort of the key issues, and as you say, there's decisions to be made, and I think those principles that are embedded in the Act provide some of that, and there's principles that need to be weighed up and compared. So, yes, social security is an investment in people. It is a means of tackling poverty. It's a public service. We also need value for money, so those need to be weighed up. But those are policy decisions for government to take, and there's many organisations which will have a variety of views on the best way of doing that. And I guess I'm assuming members are aware, but the role of SCOS is a part-time role. As SCOS commissioners, we're part-time, but we do represent a range of organisations. But when we're working for SCOS, we're very much focused within that clear scrutiny remit we have, rather than the wider policy role.
Okay, thank you. Invite Lena Whitman. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to yourselves. I'm interested in asking some questions round about the first report that came out on the implementation of the Social Security Charter. And in that report, there's a lot of good evidence that speaks to a lot of the positive interactions that individuals are having with Social Security Scotland. But it really does focus in on the issues of those individuals who have communication needs and how their communication needs are being looked after. So I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the significant issues that were kind of raised in that, and perhaps the interaction that you're having with Social Security Scotland and the Scottish Government to actually address the 7 recommendations that have come out in the report.
Yeah, as you say, that was our first report, and this is more proactive work. A lot of our work is reactive. As regulations come to us, we scrutinise them, so this is proactive. And the decision we have to take is where we put our energy and focus when we're looking at the Charter expectations. And this report came out of having a look at, so one of those sources of evidence is the statistics that are produced by Social Security Scotland, and that showed slightly lower satisfaction ratings across a number of metrics for people with communication needs. And I should stress that communication needs is the term that the survey used to identify people, so that's why we've used that category. So that just highlighted that maybe there's something there for us to investigate, and that's our kind of role within the Charter work, to investigate these issues. I mean, I guess it should be noted that still satisfaction was high for that group. I think 84% of people with communication needs expressed a positive experience. And so people were a lot of ways getting a good experience, but we were interested in investigating the differences between that group and other people, because we want the system to work for everyone. And our findings broadly fit into sort of 3 broad categories. So one is interaction with staff, another is barriers that people faced, and issues with the application process. And as you'll see from the report, generally participants viewed Social Security Scotland quite well. It was listening, it was respectful, it was friendly. The questions they were asked were clearer and less intrusive, which I think is really important. And I think that points to building a social security system based on principles, and this is the outcome of that. You've got a system that this is how people feel. But we've done the report because there were instances where some of these expectations were maybe not being fulfilled as fully or as consistently as we would have hoped. So we heard situations where people maybe had to more than once ask for communication in a way that was suitable for them. There might have been delays or things took slightly longer because people had requested it in different formats. There was issues as well sometimes with third-party assistance. So this is when you've got somebody who is supporting somebody. Some issues were raised there as well. I guess we acknowledge it was quite small-scale research, so we did commission some research with some other organisations to carry out some understanding of lived experience. So it's really, there's more work to be done to understand the full issues around that, and I think that's a key part of our scrutiny work, is taking a look at something and saying, well, here's where we need to go next. I guess it is worth noting that the feedback from people with communication needs who had experience of Social Security Scotland and of the DWP felt their experience was better than it had been under DWP, but highlighted some very real issues that need to be addressed. And so you're also asking what's happened since then. So throughout the process, I guess, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we do our scrutiny of regulations, we work closely with officials. And whilst we were producing the Charter report, we worked with officials at Social Security Scotland. We had a couple of meetings with them to share the findings and understand why these things were happening. So we've got more of an understanding of why these issues were raised, and they've been very interested in our feedback and receptive to picking up those challenges of what we were. And I think what's interesting is some of these issues, so the issue around third-party assistance, we highlighted it in the context of people with communication needs, but Social Security Scotland already picked up on that as a bigger issue around how third-party support works for people who need that assistance. And so our specific, helped highlight, added to their evidence base of a problem they were already aware of and resolving. Some details of some of the stuff around, for example, the processes they use to communicate with claimants, highlighted that by tweaking that process, they could produce formats they could produce communications in different formats in an easier way, and they've just started some work on that. In fact, I think they've just published a blog that goes into quite a lot of detail as to the issues and how they're being addressed. And some of them were Scotland-wide things. So there was delays sometimes in getting a British Sign Language interpreter, but it turns out that's a wider issue than just Social Security. So there's issues, when we flag something up, it could be detail or it could be large scale. And I think that's really important when we do our Charter work. Do you want to add anything? No.
I guess one of the issues that struck me was the fact that there's not enough of awareness round about voiceability. And Voiceability is an organisation, obviously, that's directly, engaged to do that work with claimants who are using Social Security Scotland. So I'm wondering what kind of proactive work might be being undertaken to address that gap in awareness of that service.
So I think that was one of several issues which we've highlighted, again, in this specific context, which looks like a broader issue. And again, when this was raised with Social Security Scotland, they are aware of that. So we don't know exactly where those barriers are and why people aren't accessing that service. And so that's a further piece of work that needs to be done. Now, whether that fits under our remit as a piece of work on the Charter, or whether that's something that Social Security Scotland need to carry out to understand, we don't know. But I guess in our piece of work, we didn't go into a huge amount of detail because, generally speaking, the people with communication needs weren't aware of that service or weren't using it. So that's what we do know. The question is why. There's many, many reasons for that. And are there specific things that people with communication, specific barriers that people with communication needs are facing to accessing the service, or is there other barriers that people are not able to access the service? So that's something that now needs to be looked into in more detail.
Okay, thanks for that. And I guess the last thing from myself is about perhaps the lessons that you've learned from that first foray into actually interrogating the Charter, and what aspect of the Charter you're maybe going to report on next time.
I guess in terms of lessons learned, I mean, there's some sort of specifics in the report. So, for example, as we did the analysis, we realised that we didn't have a huge number of clients who had communication needs resulting from neurodivergence. So it was kind of like, well, that's something that we need to flag and make sure explore. And also what came up is there's also issues for people whose first language is not English, which we didn't look in this report. So there's some specific things that come out of the report that we've picked up on, and that kind of leads into what next. So that is the question, what next? Do we explore some of these issues in more detail? Do we take a broader look at parts of the Charter and look at it through that perspective, or do we look at another specific issue or specific issues that we are highlighting? And so what we've done, so we have a Charter subcommittee which manages that, and as you mentioned, we had an away day last month, and what we're going to do is work through some of these ideas with that. And coming back to the question of resource, so our budget this year is 550,000, so an increase on last year, which gives us a bit more room to play with what else we can do. So I think the key thing that really worked well on this research was working with other stakeholders to do some of that research with us, and so it's how we can collaborate to maximise our resource to do as much as we can. And then the other question is, how do we add value to what else is happening? And that's where our discussions with Social Security Scotland are interesting. So what are they doing and where's their gaps? And there's already some discussion about where that might fit. And coming back to the question around the wider stakeholders, we're reaching out to wider stakeholders to say what issues are there, and we're hearing a lot of stuff that's coming up. And interestingly, one of the issues that's coming from wider stakeholders is the issues around third-party assistance more generally. So it all kind of, we start to see, well, here's a pattern, where can we tease something out of here that's useful, that adds our expertise to the mix, but isn't just duplicating what other people are doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just to say as well, when you mentioned about BSL, I know our Equalities Committee are undertaking a BSL inquiry, so hopefully a lot of good comes for that, and it filters through into Social Security as well. So thanks for that. I'm now going to invite Jeremy in. Thanks.
Thank you, Camilla, and good morning. Thank you also for coming. Just to follow up finally on that, and it's, I don't know whether this came up at all, but interested. I know it's not within your recommendations, but we've obviously debated over the last 8 years whether the Charter should have any legal basis, whether people felt it would have a better impact. I'm just wondering, did that come up in any of your conversations, and is it something you might be looking at in future reviews of the Charter?
So the Charter did come up in a bit of our work, and it was about people's awareness of the Charter, which was relatively low. But partly the Charter is there to provide that framework to make sure stuff's happening. And so we had a bit of discussion about how important it is people know what the detail of the Charter is and how important it is to use it as a framework. In terms of having legal standing, I guess, so we were involved in the review of the Charter, but that was before I became chair. So I might ask if you had anything to add, but I don't know if that came up. And I guess, again, the Charter is as it is. It will be reviewed again. I can't remember the next review date, but that will be looked at. And so when that happens, we will then undertake a piece of work to understand what the issues are and what we want to address. So there are clearly positives and negatives of having it on having sort of a legal basis of it, but we haven't done that work at the moment. I don't think that was a focus of the previous Charter changes, but yeah, next time we have a sort of statutory role in reviewing of that Charter. So when it's next reviewed, if that's an issue that come up, we will look at all of the issues around that.
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose it's based on, does the Charter have enough teeth? And I guess for us it feels like early days, having just stepped into that proactive work, looking at whether people are getting the service that they can expect from the Charter. So I guess with a few more years' experience, maybe returning to that question would be a good idea. I mean, I suppose it does have a legal underpinning in the sense that it's how the Social Security principles which are in the Act are made real in practice. So it's already got some kind of legal basis in that sense. But I know you're thinking more in terms of teeth, and yeah. So maybe a bit more experience and then come back to see how well it's operating now, I would think. But to be honest, we haven't gone any further than that, have we?
No.
Thank you. I mean, I wonder if I could start this question with you, Judith, just because you've got a wee bit more experience on this one. Do you think, as you look back in regard to the regulations, particularly that you scrutinise, are there common themes that you pick up almost every time? And what kind of things are we learning, or are you learning, that would be helpful to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it makes me want to go back and do a real analysis of all those reports. We've done quite a lot now. I can pick out a few common themes, though, from where we tend to comment in our scrutiny reports. So one is technical issues. So I sort of specialise, if you like, in social security law. I'm interested in that, and I'm very well aware how complex it is. And sometimes in the draft regulations that we see, which are a work in progress, but it's not clear that as drafted when we see them, that they completely meet the policy intention. And that can be a problem, and we do try and pick up on that as much as we can. But that's a pretty regular area. I mean, just to give an example, a recent one. So there's draft regulations to introduce a new carer additional person payment for carers who get carer support payment for one person, but they also care for someone else. And that means to get the carer support payment, you need to care for 35 hours a week. To get the new payment, it's 20 hours a week. Now, we understand that the intention is that those hours can run concurrently. But from stakeholders, we heard that they assumed you had to have them one on top of the other, 35 hours and another 20. And the regulations don't make that clear. So we've spotted that with the help of stakeholders. And we know that confusion could put people off from getting what they're entitled to. So we've recommended the regulations make that explicit. So that's an example of those kind of technical issues. Another thing that comes up a lot is that, and could have important consequences, is when you see a mismatch between what the regulations say and what's likely to happen in practice. And it's really important to catch that before the regulations come in, because once it's in law, it can be quite hard to pick up later, to unpick it all, when people have already had entitlement that maybe they're not due, or maybe things that they've not been able to claim. So an example of that is again a carer's example. It's from the original set of regulations. There's a provision there that says if you're due a back date of carer support payment, you're due arrears that are only going to reduce another DWP benefit, pound for pound. What they can do is just pay the carer the net amount they're due. So it spares the carer from having to deal with an overpayment. So it's a useful provision. But as drafted, we saw, and it was quite hard to see, it was quite buried, that the regulations didn't calculate those amounts correctly. Now, no doubt in practice it would have all have happened as it was meant to happen. But then there would have been a mismatch between people's rights under the law and what they were actually getting in practice. And that really shouldn't happen. But it does, it's not intended, but that's where scrutiny, really that expert scrutiny, can help to pick those things up before they become a problem. So that's an important one. Processes, there's always a communication plan. So we look at the legislation in terms of sort of detail of legislation, but we also try and think ahead about what the processes might need to be to put that into practice. So there's always a communication plan coming along with proposals. But there are cases where we think that needs to be enhanced or tailored in particular. So a kind of one-size-fits-all communication plan isn't necessarily right in all cases. So for an example, again, we saw that the experience of older carers that they told us really wasn't as it should be from the system that we were inheriting in Scotland, and that really needed to improve, and that needed a tailored response. So we recommended that, and the Scottish Government has accepted it. Convener, you made the point that we're not in the policy sphere, and we're not, but there are some policy choices that might affect people's experience of the system, and I'm thinking about what comes up a lot is terminology, new terminology that's chosen. as Scotland tries to build a system with dignity and respect. They try and choose better language to do that. But sometimes language that's inclusive and appropriate can still be confusing. And so when it is, we try and recommend that that's really, if we pick that up from stakeholders, we recommend that there should be further testing of that. So those are the kind of broad areas where I've thought that comes up a lot. There no doubt are others.
No, much helpful. I know at the start of the process, and obviously these timescales are quite tight for you, because you don't get that long to do the scrutiny work. Are you coping with that? Is it easier now that you're back to a kind of full team, or is that something that still gives you concern?
It is easier now. Yes, it is. Having a full team makes a big difference. We're still kind of reviewing how we make best use of the resource that we've got. And although it's better, we can still be more effective. We're thinking about how we pull more expertise in, because we almost need a certain amount of resource before we can think about managing pulling external expertise in. But that's something we'll think about in the future. But yes, it is challenging when we get more than one version of a set of regulations or new provisions that come very late in the process. We want to do a thorough job. We can't always do the consultation that we want to do when it comes very late in the day. I think overall it is better though. Yeah.
If I can move on just briefly to primary legislation. So again, you've obviously had 6 years of scrutinising primary legislation. Any lessons that collectively you've learnt as we look at future development of Scottish social security, without getting into policy, but just think how it's done, the way it's done, anything around that?
Well, I suppose it's actually, interestingly, not in our remit to look at primary legislation, although all the secondary legislation that is within our remit flows from that primary legislation, so we have to be very aware of it, for sure. I suppose I would say that, in my experience, the social security principles are really important, and you can see them playing out in practice as policies being developed and legislated for. So I think that's the main lesson. Like, the social security principles are there for a reason, and that means that as we're changing the system, which it must do, that policy needs to be developed in a considered way. And so that means developing it with the people of Scotland on the basis of evidence, as the principles say we should. That takes time to do it, and we should take the time it needs to do it properly. The improvements, the principles have got something to say about that as well, and that's that the improvement should, continual improvement to the system should put the needs of those who require assistance first. And those are basic things, but quite powerful things that do drive how primary legislation, the big picture framework for benefits should be developed. So I would say keep a strong focus on those principles.
Thank you for your time. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Marie McNair in. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Obviously, you reported earlier on the 3 sets of regulations, obviously winter heating, carers and cross-border moves. Is there any other issues concerning any of these regulations that you want to highlight to the committee?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. So, yeah, I think the pension age winter heating payment regulations have thrown up some issues. I think we've reported on several different sets of these over the last couple of years. I think one almost advantage of that is there's some issues that we've kind of been able to flag up repeatedly, and it's a slightly different benefit in that it's paid automatically, but people who don't get that automatic payment can make a claim. And because that's quite different from most of the other benefits, we've kind of flagged up that needs to be watched carefully. Are there certain groups who aren't getting the automatic payment and need to make claims? Is there issues around who's making a claim and who isn't? And also the need for clear information going out to people to understand what's happening. And I think just we maybe didn't touch on this a huge amount in the report, but as Judith mentioned, the policy making is embedded. The Charter talks about policy making. It talks about embedding the principles of social security in policy making, and it's challenging to make policy in that way when it's being made quickly. And one of the challenges that's arisen around winter heating payment is in-year changes to budget that are happening by decisions that are made at a UK level, changing Scottish budget, which understandably means changing policy. I mean, it's very hard to do that policy in a way that we want to see it done, which is in line with the Charter. So that is challenging, and we've submitted regulations, and there's now been further changes and new regulations, which we will also scrutinise, but there is a danger that stuff is missed in that high-speed policy development and the way that we're scrutinising it. Carer support regs, again, I don't think they've been laid yet, but a few things that we kind of comment on that. I guess carer support regs there's been slight changes to the system after the safe and secure transfer, but this is the first sort of big change that makes a big difference in Scotland. Carers will be under a different system. So I think that's important again. But as I think Judith touched on, it's important that that's clearly communicated, and the naming that's being used is really clear to people. And one thing that came back from stakeholders is that maybe the names that have been chosen, they need to be just looked at carefully. But another thing that came through stakeholders, and this comes back to what I touched on in the report, is people whose English isn't their first language have an additional challenge. Sometimes the language around social security can be hard to understand, and if English isn't your first language, is an even harder challenge. And so one of the things is for Social Security Scotland to think about how they're going to manage that. And I think one of the things that kind of then reflects on is what happens next. And so it's like, then the challenge is, this is a recommendation which we hope will be accepted by Social Security Scotland, but then how do we make sure that's happening? And that comes back to, I guess, the question on the Charter work. Do we use our previous recommendations as hooks to go back and look and say, well, we recommended this, you've agreed to do it, what's happened? Or even, we recommended this, you've done it, and it didn't turn out how we like, or we recommended something that you didn't accept, and you were right not to accept it because it's working fine as it is. So we can use those kind of hooks. And the final one was some cross-border regulations. And these are quite interesting because as we've moved from case transfer, so case transfer will be finishing mostly this year and into early next year, we've had a system where you've almost got two systems, CWP and Social Security Scotland, working in tandem to transfer people over. Once that finishes, you've got two separate systems, and the cross-border regulations, we had a few comments to make around that, but I think the overarching thing is that it's incumbent on Social Security Scotland and the DWP to make moving between the systems as easy as possible and picking up those cross-border issues. If you're a carer who happens to live in Carlisle but care for a disabled person who lives in Scotland, for example, how can we make sure that those cross-border issues really work well?
Thanks. Obviously, we're talking about carers there. I mean, do you think there could be an issue in the future with passporting, carers element in UC?
So I guess this is one of the issues that we now face, because up until now, and I think supported across the board, has been this idea of safe and secure transition. When we're moving people onto a new system, let's keep the rules the same, or the rules the same. The processes can be improved and done differently, which is what happens in Scotland, but the rules are the same, which makes those two systems run in tandem. And this has always been the question, what happens when those systems start to diverge? And I think a lot of the thinking that was done around that is thinking about what happens if changes are made to the Scottish system, but Social Security never stays static. Any of us who've been involved in Social Security for as long as we have, it's constantly changing, and you get changes on both sides of the system. So yes, there could be issues around this passporting, around the way that the devolved benefits, particularly the disability benefits and carers benefits, interact with the reserve benefits, particularly universal credit and pension credits. And what's important to focus on is the people that are using the system. So the person that's using the system, the carer that's using the system, the disabled person who has a carer, what's going on behind the scenes, who's responsible for what, doesn't matter. What they need to do is make sure they know what they're getting and they get the right payments on time. So I think it's incumbent on Social Security Scotland and DWP to work through this and work, and it's also incumbent on the government, the UK and the Scottish governments, to work through the issues and make sure they happen. Around passport in particular, there's very specific issues, and the details get very, very complex. So I think there's definitely a piece of work to be done to understand what options there are, how it can work as systems start to maybe slightly diverge, what can be done to make sure that for the people who use the system, it's working.
Yeah. I mean, I think with these current proposals that are coming in, legally, I don't think there's going to be a problem with the passporting. I think that's okay, because the new payments are just on top and different. They're not changing carer support payment itself. It's adding different components to it. So I think legally it'll be all right. Operationally, it'll be a challenge for DWP, for Social Security Scotland to manage that, and for people to understand it, and for their advisors to understand it. So it's more of an operational challenge, I would say. But one of the interesting points that brings up, though, about changes is that we always need to look now whether it's going to mean that the change is too big now for that passporting to be taken for granted. And one of the things that we're interested in is who's scrutinising that. So our remit is to scrutinise regulations made by the Scottish Parliament. The Social Security Advisory Committee at UK level provides independent advice to the UK government. But there's regulations kind of in between that the UK government makes to take into account of changes to Social Security Scotland under Powers in the Scotland Act. They're not in our remit, but I don't think they're in SAC's remit either. And that could mean that there's a bit of a scrutiny gap. So sometimes those regulations might be just really just where it says one carer's allowance, make it say carer support payment instead, and maybe there's not so much to look at. But as systems diverge and those passporting arrangements change or become more complex, there's definitely scrutiny to be done there, and I'm not sure who's going to do it.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Convener, that's me.
Okay, thanks very much. Now that actually concludes our questions. So thanks very much for joining us and for your contributions this morning. It's much appreciated. Before we move into private session, understand that this will be Liz Smith's last final meeting anyway as a member of the committee. So just to say thanks, Liz, for all your valuable contributions, and wish you well in your new role. So thank you. So that concludes our public business for today, and we will now move into private session. Thank you.